Angela Sterritt has spoken with residential school survivors as part of her award-winning journalism for CBC News. She was also the first Aboriginal Massey Journalism Fellow at the University of Toronto. Her fellowship, in fact, ended just a few weeks ago. She is back now with CBC News, based out of Winnipeg, but today with me in the studio. Angela, as we've been setting the table today throughout our coverage for the release of the report tomorrow, as journalists, we're curious to see the wording and what's in it, but the wider Aboriginal community in Canada, how high are the expectations for this report?
Well, I think one of the things that's the most important about this report is survivors finally able to tell their story and be recognized, not just downplaying what happened at residential school as, oh, it wasn't that bad, but finally hearing some of the most horrific stories that we've all had the chance to hear now. The significance of this for survivors is that healing component, being recognized of their stories being told across Canada to Canadians, to non-Indigenous Canadians, and also having this on a historical record. So all these stories will be kept. 7,000 statements have been recorded and will be kept on a historical record so that all Canadians will become aware of what happened in the schools. So for survivors, I think this is greatly important. We're hearing some of the terms such as genocide, cultural genocide, or genocide being talked about. Finally, in my own Indigenous community, we've talked about the Red Holocaust for many years. To have these words and these terms, Justice Murray Sinclair talked about 6,000 plus Indigenous children who either died at residential school or didn't make it home or died shortly after. This is significant. He also talked about in the 1920s, there were so many deaths that the superintendent stopped recording those deaths. So there's probably a lot more than that 6,000. So these numbers are greatly important for Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people.
And as you reference some of these numbers, the most recent, the 6,000 number, just came out at the end of last week. So is it your sense that there isn't necessarily going to be new information, in the sense that when we talk about a report coming out, we're all curious to see if there are new facts and information in there, but rather the significance is the totality of it, of all of the stories being put in one place to really show the magnitude of what happened?
What I'm being told is that this report will be hard-hitting. I think what's important to recognize is that residential school happened. However, the intergenerational impacts that we see today are still ongoing. That doesn't just mean that the children of survivors, the grandchildren of survivors are experiencing the impacts. It also means that some of the policies that came out of the Indian Act of 1876, some of the policies that were carried out from residential school continue today. For example, we see in the child welfare system more Indigenous children in foster care than there was ever in a residential school. The missing and murdered Indigenous women, I think we're going to see that talked about in this report. And it's going to be talked about in terms of coming as a direct result of residential school. These are things that are going to be challenging for Canadians to deal with. The other thing in the report is the recommendations. Those recommendations are non-binding, but I think it's something that all Canadians will want to be aware of, and it's something that's also happening right now.
I want to ask you very quickly, as we're getting close to time, about this issue of genocide. As we mentioned earlier, the Prime Minister stood in the House of Commons. Jack Layton was there at the time as well, as the parties joined across the Commons in a rare recognition of what had happened with the residential school system. But the word genocide was not a part of that apology. Do you think if genocide is the way this is phrased tomorrow, and there's certainly a lot of indication that it will be, that there'll be pressure on the Prime Minister or whichever government to address that, to amend the apology or to add that wording? Will there be pressure to phrase it in that way formally?
I think that there's enough evidence at this point that it is cultural genocide, the forcible removal of Indigenous children from their culture, from their homes. Justice Murray Sinclair stated that if the evidence that we have now appeared today, this would be under the Genocide Convention and would be treated as thus. However, I don't necessarily think that this is going to be, even if it is genocide or cultural genocide, if this is what is released tomorrow, I'm not really sure that the Canadian government is going to treat this as any different than they have thus far. What I can say out of the recommendations is the most important thing going forward is the educational piece. Justice Murray Sinclair has said most Canadians don't know what residential school is. They don't know what the TRC is.
I'm going to interrupt you just there for a moment, Angela, as we go back to the House of Commons live, where the Aboriginal Affairs Minister, Bernard Melcourt, is on his feet. We want to listen in for a moment here.
Je demande que l'étude de la motion soit inscrite à l'ordre du jour. Mr. Speaker, I also have the honor to table in both official languages the Delaney Final Self-Agreement and the Delaney Tax Treatment Agreement.
Introduction of government bills. Statements by ministers. Déclaration des députés. The Honourable Minister of Aboriginal Affairs.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Monsieur le Président, je suis
Mr. Speaker, I'm honored to be here today to reaffirm our government's commitment to advancing reconciliation with Aboriginal people who suffered from the residential school system. This week marks the closing event of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. This event marks a significant milestone in the successful implementation of the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement and in meeting the goal of moving towards healing, reconciliation, and resolution of the sad legacy of the residential school system in Canada.
So today, Mr. Speaker, to all former students who have come forward to speak about their experience, to all who have shown extraordinary courage and resilience, to their families, everyone who has suffered from the impacts of this very dark chapter in our history, I would like to offer a statement of reconciliation. The strength, determination, and resilience they and many former students I have met share in discussing their experiences and in talking about the legacy of the Indian residential schools is admirable. These qualities are necessary to ensure Canadians have a greater understanding of the long-lasting harms caused by the Indian residential school system for Aboriginal people across Canada. Le 11 juin 2008, le Premier
On June
ministre
11, 2008, the Prime Minister apologized on behalf of the Government of Canada and all Canadians for the forcible removal of Aboriginal children from their homes and communities to attend Indian residential schools. In this historic apology, the Prime Minister recognized that there is no place in Canada for the attitudes that inspired the Indian residential school system to ever prevail again. The apology affirmed Canada's commitment to joining Aboriginal peoples on a journey of healing towards reconciliation.
The Commission was mandated, Mr. Speaker, with the unique opportunity to educate all Canadians on the Indian residential schools and forge a new relationship between Aboriginal peoples and other Canadians. And while this is the Commission's closing event, the work to heal the relationship between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Canadians must continue. On this day, let's commit to taking one more step together to rebuild the relationship between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Canadians. This renewed relationship requires sharing the truth. Compiled through the work of the Commission, the historical record of Indian residential schools made possible by the thousands of individuals who courageously came forward to tell their stories is an achievement of national significance.
That's right.
This profound and lasting record will help Canadians towards renewed relationships based on understanding and respect. La réconciliation, Monsieur le Président, est un objectif
Reconciliation, Mr. Speaker, is a goal that will take the commitment of multiple generations, and the Government of Canada understands the importance of transforming how it works with Aboriginal people and shifting attitudes and perceptions among all Canadians. Reconciliation is an active process that requires ongoing engagement. The government looks forward to continuing dialogue with all Canadians, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal alike, about advancing reconciliation.
To that end, Mr. Speaker, Canada is committed to working towards reconciliation, building on the Prime Minister's historic 2008 apology to former students of Indian residential schools, their families and communities. This will be achieved by acknowledging, learning from and addressing past wrongs, being responsive to Aboriginal people's expressed needs and priorities, actively engaging Canadians in reconciliation efforts, and commemorating the significant contributions of Aboriginal peoples and cultures to Canadian society. The stained glass window installed in the centre block of Parliament is a poignant reminder of the true meaning of reconciliation, not only for the members of Parliament who enter through the door above which it sits, but for all Canadians. Mr. Speaker, I'm confident that we will be able to continue healing as a nation, building on the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It is in this spirit that Canada pledges that it will continue its effort to advance reconciliation. De fait, c'est dans cet esprit que le Canada
And it's in that spirit that Canada commits to continue making its efforts towards reconciliation. Thank you.
L'honorable député de BTB, Bay James Nuvik EU.
Miigwech, Mr. Speaker. As I always do when I rise in this House, in this august place, Mr. Speaker, I want to first acknowledge that this House sits on unceded, unsurrendered Algonquin territory, land of the Anishinaabe. In fact, Mr. Speaker, in a spirit of true reconciliation, we should consider making that recognition, that acknowledgement, the norm whenever one rises in this House. Allow me to thank the Minister for his statement today, and with equal importance, Mr. Speaker, express my gratitude to the Minister for his participation in a walk for reconciliation yesterday afternoon. Miigwech, Mr. Minister. Mr. Speaker, as a survivor of the residential school system, I especially want to acknowledge and welcome to Ottawa the many fellow survivors that will be in town this week, along with their families and their friends. I pay homage to my fellow survivors, Mr. Speaker, also because very few Canadians realize that since our days in residential school, the TRC events, for many of us, are the only moments we got together again, are the only moments we see each other again, to share our stories, to say something that many of you may take for granted. We're all still here. We made it. As a survivor, Mr. Speaker, you will have guessed that it is with great anticipation that I await the release of the Commission's report tomorrow. And I want to take this opportunity to thank Justice Sinclair, Commissioner Wilson, and Commissioner Littlechild for their hard work and commitment to this cause. After the report of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples almost 20 years ago, history, our common history, Mr. Speaker, I would dare say, will provide us with yet another moment to restore harmony among the peoples of this land that we now call Canada. Tomorrow is that moment. Let us take a pause for a moment tomorrow and reflect on the way forward. History will have given us yet another occasion. Canadians want change. Canadians want us to seize the moment, Mr. Speaker. Change and reconciliation go together. Mr. Speaker, as a survivor, I can appreciate the fundamental importance of the moment we are about to experience tomorrow. Let us all collectively seize it and collectively commit to genuine change in our relations with the First Peoples of this country.
Hear, hear.
Let us set out to do what 148 years of successive governments have not managed to achieve, and that is that reconciliation. Reconciliation, Mr. Speaker, is about healing relationships, building trust, and working out our differences. It is about redress and respect for the rights of all. Reconciliation means a meaningful commitment to change, to honesty, engage in reconceptualizing relationships to create a future of peace, a future of justice, and a future of renewed hope for all of us. Mr. Speaker, I suggest that it is not possible to conceive of reconciliation in the absence of justice. Many segments of Canadian society have been honestly willing to engage in a dialogue to attain truth, to attain dignity, and above all, reconciliation. Today and into our shared future, we must continue the difficult work of building honorable relations, a fair society, and a real dialogue, Mr. Speaker, to which the Justice and the Commissioners have invited us. The adoption of the TRC report, important though it is, will not in itself change the everyday lives of women, men, and children whose experiences it honors and gives witness to. No, Mr. Speaker. For this, we need the political and constitutional commitment of not only the governments, but the support and goodwill of the public, of all Canadians, to create and implement substantial and meaningful changes in cooperation and partnership with Indigenous peoples themselves. Mr. Speaker, we are all in this together. And Mr. Speaker, change is what Canadians want. And you know what, Mr. Speaker? It happens that, along with my colleagues, I've come here to do exactly that, to bring that change. Miigwech. Thank you.
You've been listening to NDP MP Romeo Saganash speaking in the House of Commons this afternoon. His comments following that of Aboriginal Affairs Minister Bernard Valcourt. The Minister Valcourt stood to say, first of all, a recognition to all of those who took part in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The Commission's report, as we've been reporting, will be coming out tomorrow. He acknowledged their courage, their extraordinary courage, he said, and their resilience in living through a very dark chapter of Canada's history, and that would be the residential school system. He said that there would be a statement of reconciliation that he would make, and he committed that Canadians should continue the process of reconciliation. He said the government pledged to continue its efforts toward that, but there were really no specifics attached to his statement. It did, though, prompt Romeo Saganash to stand to first acknowledge that the minister had taken part in a march acknowledging the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which took place over the weekend. But he went on to say that change and reconciliation go together and that the report will need to prompt some change. He said, let's collectively seize the moment and seize change. And he also said that you cannot conceive of reconciliation in the absence of justice. And then he said, we are all in this together, prompting, as you saw, a standing ovation from his NDP colleagues in the House, though I suspect others in the House stood as well. Angela Sterritt of CBC News is with me in the studio. We've been talking about the report in advance of its release tomorrow. I'm just wondering if you had any comment on what we just heard in the House of Commons.
Right. Well, in terms of what Romeo Saganash was saying, I think he's right. If you look at the intent of the residential schools, it was literally to kill the Indian in the child. And the fact that we're all here, 7,000 to 10,000 people taking the streets, coming together with non-Indigenous people, it's a sign that we're not just surviving, we're thriving. So I think he's right in terms of we're in a celebration mode right now. There's a lot of suffering that has happened. People are recognizing that that's happened finally, but people are celebrating that they're actually here and doing well in society and practicing their cultures, learning their languages. In terms of what Valcourt said, I think it's important to note that there's still quite a long way to go in terms of reconciliation, in terms of the truth component as well. In terms of education, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission wanted in the interim report at least to have every single high school in Canada to have curriculum that focused on residential school. We're seeing that in the Northwest Territories. We're seeing that in Saskatchewan, and we're seeing that a little bit in Ontario. There's still a lot more work to do. When I talk to non-Indigenous people, I'd say about 50% know even what residential school was, never mind the horrific nature of what went on there. There's still residential school survivors fighting for their documents to prove that they went through these horrible abuses, and they're fighting the federal government for those documents. There's a number of different departments, the Library and Archives, the RCMP, Health Canada, Aboriginal Affairs. And so that's a sign too that we're not there yet. We're not at that reconciliation part. I think it's also important to note that Justice Murray Sinclair pointed out that reconciliation means not just saying we're having a great relationship now. It means actually making the steps forward to show that you're doing so. In Canada, it's pretty clear Indigenous people are still, in many regards, treated as second-class citizens. I think when we start to see that power dynamic shift, then we'll be a little bit more on our way. And just again, to touch on that truth component, if you look at places that have been through such atrocities, such as Germany, in Berlin, you see massive monuments. You see the topography of terror. You see the museum memorializing the Jews that were killed. We don't have that in Canada. We don't have that national identity that says this history happened and we're gonna make atonements, we're gonna make changes in our behavior. And we also see, again, some of those policies from residential school continuing today. We see injustices in child welfare, in Indigenous children overrepresented in foster care. We see poverty, missing and murdered Indigenous women. These are all things that I think need to be changed, and it needs to be worked on at all angles with all Canadians.
It'll be very interesting to see what the recommendations are in the report, in addition to the information collected there. And thanks so much for sharing your thoughts on this, Angela.
Thank you so much.
Angela Sterritt is with CBC News. She joined me in studio today.